Never mind the noise and the chatter. We are here for intelligent, fact-based conversation on this episode of Bergen Banter, the official Bergen Community College podcast. I am your host, Larry Levanka, and I have a guest with us today, history professor Ilan Ehrlich, who is an expert on Latin America. Yeah, I think you know where this is going. Venezuela, Latin America, in the news. Obviously, the United States has captured, abducted, however you want to put it, its president, the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. And there are a number of things that are now happening downstream. So, Professor Ehrlich, you are the expert on Latin America. Let's start on Venezuela. Before we get into Maduro and as it relates to the United States, what has that country looked like over the last 50 years? It's been unstable, to say the least.
Thank you for having me, first of all. An expert, I guess we'll have to see. I'll have to kind of prove myself. But the thing about Venezuela is, until about 2013, was one of the more well-off countries in Latin America. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. I mean, usually when people think of oil, they think the Middle East. But Venezuela was part of OPEC, large oil reserves. This is kind of the tragedy of Venezuela. Had a large middle class, was a well-off country. It did have some issues, but, just to kind of throw out a number, in 2013, Venezuela had a 30% poverty rate, which may sound high by American standards, but, one of the more well-off countries in Latin America. There were daily flights to Miami. People would go there. It's about a 2-hour flight. Go shopping in Miami in the morning and be back in Caracas by the evening. So, Venezuela was, for a long time, basically since the late 50s, democratic, multi-party democracy, fairly well off, large middle class, about a 30% poverty rate, whereas today the estimates are that Venezuela has about an 80% poverty rate, and about a 50% what economists call an extreme poverty rate, which is to say people, barely have enough to eat, and they're not. There's been a lot of studies recently on Venezuela, and one of them is that people are losing weight, people are not getting enough calories. So it's really gone from. I mean, this isn't a country like you could argue. There are other countries you would say like Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, have a long history of being very poor.
So it begs the question then: what happened?
I think sometimes we kind of minimize the role of government or governance, and essentially under the government of Nicolas Maduro, the government has been completely mismanaged to the extent that between a third and a quarter of the country have fled. And so I think this is one of the things we have to kind of keep in mind, and this is one of the things that's one of the, part of the calculus of, why do you intervene in a place like Venezuela? One of the things is, Venezuelans are everywhere. Millions of them are in Colombia, they're in Brazil, they're in Peru, they're in Mexico, they're in the United States. And to a degree, this is destabilizing for the region. Not to kind of justify anything, but just to sort of say, from a strictly policy standpoint, 8 million people being displaced, it's a problem, and it's problematic, and it's definitely something, ideally, I think one of the things that's probably in the mind of U.S. policymakers is, to try to create a Venezuela where a good portion of those 8 million people might want to go back to Venezuela. Because it's not only an issue of, obviously, we're in a little bit of a touchy mood about immigration in the U.S. right now, but there are far more Venezuelans in Colombia and in Brazil and in neighboring places And I think there's a feeling in those countries as well that, that it would be nice if some of those Venezuelans would be able to go home. And I think a lot of Venezuelans would like to go home too. I think this is also an issue.
So tracing sort of the destabilization to Maduro, right, and his time as president, what was being mismanaged? We know that the country has extensive natural resources. You talked about the oil for sure. That mismanagement took what kind of form? Government corruption, et cetera?
Well, I'd say, it doesn't only, we can't only blame. So Maduro was appointed the successor to Hugo Chavez. And Chavez, one of the things that he did, so the oil industry is a very technocratic, technical, you have engineers, you have, people who are working in the industry. And Chavez, so, Venezuela was producing 4 to 5 million barrels a day of oil. And nowadays, the estimates are about 800,000 barrels a day. And, if you're talking about an oil country and oil wealth. And so one of the reasons why that is Hugo Chavez decided that people in working in the Venezuelan oil industry, he basically appointed cronies who kind of didn't know much about the industry, but he wanted loyal people. He wanted to fire people who he felt were not loyal to his project. So that's one of the issues. Venezuela has many of them, but that's one of them.
Fascinating. Yeah. So perhaps even a lesson for others. Yeah. The United States and its role in Venezuela, it's not as if that this is the first time that we have interacted with the politicians in the country, including Chavez.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think to give this some context, there was a coup in 1948 in Venezuela, and it had to do with oil. U.S. oil companies have always been in Latin America, famously in Mexico, which nationalized its oil in 1938. So, this is a normal thing. U.S. oil companies often had expertise that Latin American countries did not. So, the model that was established was that, U.S. oil companies would be given a concession and then they would pay taxes. And so there was always a debate in Latin American societies. So in Venezuela, the debate was, all right, so you had this president in 1948 named Rómulo Gallegos who decided, so the division of taxes was that U.S. oil companies or foreign oil companies would pay 43% taxes, and he raised it to 50%. Okay. And by the way, this is something, in Mexico, you had a similar situation of a Mexican president in the early 20th century. Francisco Maduro tried to do something similar, and he was overthrown as well. But anyway, this led to him being overthrown by the army, but there was encouragement and negotiations, on the part of the U.S. To do this because the U.S. has traditionally defended the interests of U.S. companies in Latin America. So this is kind of, you could say, that this has happened before a little bit in Venezuela, although it's not a perfect analogy to what's going on now. But then after that, civilian rule did return. And again, Venezuela became almost, in many ways a model of what Latin America could be. It was a democracy. You had alternating political parties. You had a relatively low poverty rate. You had a reasonably large middle class. But again, 30%, that 30% kind of poverty rate was something that bubbled up, and it was an issue. And it's one of the reasons, Hugo Chavez was somebody who wanted to kind of do something about that. And there was a feeling that, was there a way to kind of address this? And then the other thing is, one of the issues to think about with Venezuela, like a lot of Latin American countries, it's a commodity-based economy. So you could say Venezuela, is very dependent on oil, the way that Cuba was on sugar, the way that Chile was on copper. In many Latin American countries, they're basically dependent on the price of commodities, and commodities go up and they go down, and when the price of when you have oil prices are low, it becomes very hard for people. Just like when sugar prices were low, like in Cuba, they used to call these the year of the fat cows and the year of the skinny cows, to use a biblical kind of.
You talk about commodities, though, and we've talked so much already about Venezuela's oil, but it's another pretext or commodity, and that is drugs, that has been the pretext for the United States, or at least that's what they're saying publicly.
Yes.
Okay, we agree, or there is a drug trade that is coming out of Venezuela.
Yes.
Is it a clear and present danger to the United States? Is it something that needs to have action, or are we really just after the oil here?
Well, okay. So Nicolas Maduro was indicted on drug charges in 2020. Mm-hmm. He's not the first in Latin America. The president of Honduras, who Trump actually pardoned in November, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was also indicted and extradited to the United States. His brother was also convicted on drug charges. Whether drug trafficking is a threat to the United States, it depends on your perspective. I mean, obviously, this is. Is it something that's going to destabilize the U.S. government anytime soon? Not really. But is, Nicolas Maduro in legitimate kind of league with drug trafficking? Absolutely. The other kind of issue is, Venezuela tanked its economy essentially, especially its oil economy, through the firing of competent kind of oil managers and engineers and whatnot. And so Venezuela has become in many ways like a mafia state. It is home to terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, which also profits from the drug trade. You have a daily flight from Tehran to Caracas, and there was actually a researcher who said, I want to kind of see, like, can I, try to go on and say, like, can I get a ticket on this flight? And he found it was always full. And really what it is it's members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard who kind of go to Venezuela and kind of are in the drug trade. So, there's another issue. I mean, Trump didn't really play this up, but, Venezuela is also linked. And one of the reasons why you'd say, well, Venezuela and Iran, what do they have in common? They were both in OPEC, and so they had that kind of link together. But Venezuela plays host to terrorist organizations, also to Colombian kind of revolutionary terrorist organizations as well. But, the drug thing isn't invented. It's certainly not, I wouldn't say any more of an, I don't think it's a major national security threat, but he's a legitimate, he's legitimately involved in the trade.
Right. And I don't think anybody, whether you agree with the United States foreign policy on the matter, is going to say, well, Maduro was a good guy, he shouldn't have been overthrown. People would disagree about the method by which the United States took. And I think that's where I want to go next.
Sure.
Regime change is not something that the United States is a stranger to. Of course, in the Middle East, as we talked about earlier, mixed results, obviously, to say the best. In Latin America, regime change, Grenada, Panama, etc. We've been down this road before as well. Are those situations analogous to what we're seeing right now in Venezuela?
I mean, I think the most analogous and that most people might remember of a certain age was when the U.S. Went after Manuel Noriega in 1989 under George H.W. Bush. And, there are some things in common to this. Noriega was also indicted on drug charges. Ironically, he was also a CIA asset, and he was very useful to the United States during the Cold War. And when he stopped being useful, this was essentially, I think a lot of times we think of the United States government as a single actor, but throughout this period, the State Department wanted Noriega brought up on drug charges, and the CIA protected him as long as he was useful. I think, in terms of Maduro, the U.S. was pressuring Maduro to leave Maduro had stolen an election in 2024. As part of a deal with the United States, Maduro was supposed to conduct an honest election and abide by the results. It was clear that Maduro lost by a landslide in this election, and he remained anyway. And so there's that element as well. There was pressure, and there's pretty good evidence that the Vatican was quietly acting as an intermediary. The Vatican acts this way a lot, actually, in Latin America. Was often an intermediary between the U.S. and Cuba, and so the Vatican was kind of trying to try to mediate this idea that maybe Maduro would just kind of leave.
Find a diplomatic way to exit.
But Maduro decided that, he wasn't going to do this. And I think to a degree, obviously there is a long history of the U.S., especially in Latin America, going after regime change. Yeah. But this is more in the early to mid 20th century. And, I think Grenada is a small island of 100,000 people. Panama, you could sort of argue maybe more, but this hasn't really been super common of late. I think the administration just felt that it probably wanted him gone, and it used all the levers to try to do this in a quiet way or in a way that looks nice. And, we obviously have a president that doesn't really care a lot about the niceties that other presidents have. And I think a previous president might have just, certainly there would have been pressure under a Biden. Biden certainly wanted him gone too. So I think it's important to keep in mind this is not a partisan issue. I think Republican administrations and Democratic administrations were not happy with Maduro, and they both wanted him gone. They both saw him as an illegitimate leader. They both saw him as a destabilizing force, as a host for terrorism, as a host for lawlessness. Destabilizing force in the region, given that, a third of Venezuelans, are outside of Venezuela. And so I think both wanted to do something about it. I think Trump probably had fewer qualms about the optics of it.
Right. And all of that can be true.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that people at home in the United States were asking for it or see the value in it, especially in the president's circles that talk about America first.
Right.
So does it really then just come back to the natural resources that now the U.S. may or may not have access to?
It's weird because the U.S., I think, again, like growing up, the U.S. is one of the largest oil producers in the world. I don't know if this is a widely known thing among Americans. Again, I'm a little bit older. I remember when there were debates in the 1990s about, can the U.S., when the U.S. was more dependent on oil or outside oil. But, given the shale revolution, the U.S. produces something like 14 million barrels of oil a day, or a little more than that. The U.S. does not need Venezuela's oil.
But does it want the opportunity to control it so it can derive the economic benefit from it? Is that possibly what Trump is after?
I don't think anyone knows what Trump is after. Yeah. I don't know if Trump knows what Trump is after completely. I think, one of the issues with Venezuela's oil industry is it's become so run down and decrepit, and it is not run in a modern way. It's not run competently. Trump in his press conference was talking about getting U.S. companies in there, but U.S. companies, if you're a U.S. company, it's going to take a huge investment to get any, the Venezuelan oil industry is damaged goods.
And I think that's what ExxonMobil was saying.
Yes, so they're not interested because you'd have to make substantial investments before you would see any kind of profit. And I'm not sure there's that kind of demand for oil right now either. I think it's one of those things. It's an easy thing to fall back on. I don't think the oil is a non-factor, but I don't think oil was the reason why, why the U.S. kind of went in there. And I don't think, whatever profits are there to be had. There's not a huge amount of money that's there to be had right now. I think the big issue is trying to get Venezuela's oil industry up and running so that the money can be used to kind of rehabilitate Venezuela a little bit. And then, you have the other issue of, it's a poor country, and if the money can kind of be used for the benefit of Venezuelans, I think that would maybe bring immigrants kind of back.
That sounds more analogous then, not to Panama or Grenada, but more like Iraq, right? And the pretext for going into Iraq to bring democracy, et cetera. But in Iraq, we sort of broke it, so we bought it. Are we going to head down a similar path in your view in Venezuela, or is it too early to project?
I think that would. I don't think there's much of an appetite in the U.S. for that. I don't
for a forever war, right?
Or not even a forever war, but
intervention.
Just, do we want to see? I don't think. I think Iraq is a little bit of a different ball of whatever you want to call it
for a number of reasons.
But I do think. I don't think the U.S. wants to occupy Venezuela. I don't think you want to have a large military presence. I don't think there would be some massive insurgency in Venezuela like you had in Iraq. But I do think, does the U.S., do we want to see, flag-draped coffins coming in, even if there's not that many of them?
Right.
Like do U.S. parents want their kids to die for Venezuela? I don't think so. And I think both parties recognize that. And I think
does the president though? Because when the president says we're going to run the country, that is that just bluster? Is that just the president being the president?
Maybe, but like let's look at it now, right? Is there a large? There's probably some, maybe some special forces contingent are in the country, but they basically took Maduro. He's facing trial right now in New York. And I think the idea is to lean on the remaining leaders and hopefully perhaps, you have a figure who was supported by an estimated 2/3 of the population. Right. She wasn't allowed to run because the government kind of feared that she would win. But she won the Nobel Peace Prize, Corina Machado. And so, there is a sense that perhaps eventually you want to kind of hand this off to, someone who's a local leader. And so I think, obviously we don't know. No, but if you look at what's going on right now, you have the vice president ostensibly in charge, who is very closely linked to Cuba. But right now it's kind of in this intermediate phase, right? The vice president has said that they're willing, she's willing to work with the United States and willing to kind of, go with, where the winds are blowing, so to speak. But there hasn't really been, since Maduro was taken, it's not like the government has been cleared out or that Venezuela's military has been kind of disarmed or anything like that. So I think, I don't know. I hope there's a plan. There's probably are some plans being debated. But I think it's a hard, I don't think Trump even knows where this is going to go.
Fair enough. Still though, looking at Venezuela as part of Latin America, and I understand one country is not like another, but there are other countries in Latin America that are similar to Venezuela in different ways. Is Venezuela the tip of the spear in Latin America? Do you foresee a scenario where U.S. intervention is going to proliferate into other areas? You're an expert on Cuba. You brought up Cuba.
Right.
Could that be in the offing?
I don't know. The U.S. has been talking about Cuba forever.
For sure.
I don't think anybody really knows. Again, is the U.S. going to sort of start getting, I think the U.S. will use the levers that it's been using in Latin America, which are more economic and diplomatic and things like this. I think Trump tends to be very blustery. But I think, again, you can, like Trump said he's going to run Venezuela. Like, how is the U.S. running Venezuela right now? I mean, so it's hard to kind of say. I don't think there's an appetite to, Trump mentioned, Mexico for a second and he said, oh, like she's a nice lady, the president of Mexico. But I don't think, I don't see this being in the offing. I do think the U.S. will use the kind of traditional levers of pressure, which are kind of good enough. And again, I don't think the U.S. wants to sort of, I don't think the U.S. is in a mood for kind of military interventions really anywhere. I think this is a little bit off topic, but people think about China and Taiwan, for example, and the U.S. It's been the policy of, again, presidents of both parties to sort of try to be vague, but to try to say, President Biden said the U.S. would defend Taiwan, but I think it would be massively unpopular in U.S. public opinion, even though Taiwan is a democracy and, has a lot in common with the United States. But I think it would be massively unpopular for the U.S. to kind of intervene militarily, even, if China intervened, even though this would be sort of a, kind of a clear-cut bad guys versus good guys kind of thing. So I do think, I don't see a lot of, military boots going on the ground anywhere, and certainly not in Latin America.
So as it relates to Venezuela, then, as we start to come back to where we started, which is where Venezuela has been under Maduro and beyond, what do you think happens in the country next? Do you think they do have an opportunity to stabilize? Is it going to be contingent on the United States' interactions, or do you think it comes from within, as you talked about earlier?
It's hard. I mean, I think the current government, so, one of the ways that Venezuela was run under Maduro was the governors had a lot of power of the different provinces, and Maduro basically said, you have to be loyal to me and I demand your loyalty, but within your province, you can make money doing whatever you want. If it's drug trafficking, if it's some kind of offering protection using the but whatever you want to do in your province, as long as you're loyal to me, you can sort of, and this is why the term
very
mafia
much,
state,
a criminal syndicate.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
If you want to have Hezbollah there, or if you want to kind of, have your own thing going on, if you're loyal to me, that's the main kind of thing. But so you got rid of Maduro, you still have these governors. Delcy Rodriguez, who's the vice president, was one of those. And so I think you're going to have to sort of deal with those people in a way. I don't know how you deal with those people. Do you deal with those people in a way, if you have a democratic transition, do you basically say, listen, you guys can keep your money and you're going to be very powerful, but you cannot remain as kind of the governor because that's going to be an elected position. It's a complicated thing, and I think Trump doesn't really deal in those kind of complexities. I'm sure the State Department is thinking about this. I'm sure, my sense is the United States is probably trying to think about what's the easiest kind of solution that requires the least amount of, U.S. investment and effort. And then there's also the issue that, Venezuela owes a lot of money too. So
getting the
Venezuela,
oil industry.
Well, one of the thing is, so Venezuela under Chavez and under Maduro, so they owe. So there's three ways that Venezuela owes money. They have bonds, which they're in default on, and a lot of those bonds have been sold off to private equity companies and whatnot. And the way bonds work is, nobody expects to get the full amount back because Venezuela is destitute. And so, but Venezuela, that's the other thing, right? How does so presumably if Venezuela rejoins kind of the world economy, it's not operating in this kind of criminal kind of economy, or and so. So, the vast amount of the money that it's owed is owed to bondholders, and they would have to negotiate some kind of, do they accept 30% of the face value or of the value, or 40%? So that's one issue. The other issue is some equipment and whatnot of the oil industry was just expropriated by Venezuela. So, I think, to a degree, when Trump talks about the oil companies, they're owed some money in terms of that. But again, I think, if you're an oil company executive, you're not thinking, oh, Venezuela is where we want to be.
That's right. You're going to write it off.
You want to get, I think you want to get the quickest, also, Venezuelan oil, this is also something that's not being talked about. They have a large amount of reserves, but Venezuela's oil has a lot of sulfur, and it requires heavy refining. So that's the other, that's kind of another issue on top of everything. So it's more expensive to sort of get to market than other oil as well. And the third part is China was essentially lending money to Venezuela in exchange for cut rate oil. And China basically stopped because they felt like they weren't getting it wasn't worth it anymore. So, Venezuela is a problem on a number of levels.
For sure.
And, it's going to take a while, and it's going to be complicated, and it's, I think ultimately, ideally, I think Venezuela's handed over to a democratically elected government, but, democracy isn't going to magically kind of solve the problems of Venezuela either.
It's messy, as we know.
If anything, I think it might, under democracy, people can complain. You can't just throw them in jail. You can't just shoot them. You can't just, one of the, nice things that a little bit of U.S. pressure did with Venezuela is Venezuela recently released a little over 1,000 political prisoners. Some of them have been talking about how they were tortured and mutilated and the way they were treated in this prison. And so, Venezuela didn't have to kind of deal with any kind of dissent or you had the safety valve of just forcing people to leave, which a lot of people did. And so I think Venezuela will be, even under, especially under democracy with a free press and freedom of, speech and whatnot, will be a very contentious place and a place of a lot of complaints because it's going to be very poor for a long time. It kind of goes back to, it's much easier to break something than to build something. Right. And Venezuela kind of, to a degree, you could say, there were some laudable sentiments trying to kind of assuage the poverty of the 30% of the population that was living in poverty and that was not kind of sharing in the wealth of Venezuela. And, Hugo Chavez and some other members of the military. So to kind of go into a little bit of a backstory, in 1989, you had these massive riots in Caracas and some other provincial cities over cost of living. It was a time where oil prices weren't so great, and the government was kind of doing like an austerity program, and a lot of things were subsidized in Venezuela, especially things like public transport. And so when people, especially poor people, paying the full price of public transport, people, were very upset about this. And the army was called in to kind of put down these, yet a massive riot in Venezuela. And the army kind of brutalized a lot of people. Hugo Chavez was among them. And a lot of people in the army felt that this was kind of a horrible thing for government to be calling in the army to kind of brutalize kind of poor and kind of humble people. And so there was a legitimate feeling among people, and I think it's important to kind of keep this in mind, that people wanted, or there were people who really wanted to sort of say, can we do something about this third of the country that it's not really sharing in this oil wealth, and that's kind of living a very, makeshift kind of lifestyle. Caracas is the way it's laid out. It's kind of on a plain, and then you have kind of mountains, and you'd basically have this population, because Caracas is the capital city and a place of opportunity, it grew very quickly, and it drew in a lot of people from the countryside. In colonial times, Caracas was not one of the larger cities in Spanish America. And it was kind of a sleepy colonial town, and then you have this kind of massive urbanization. And, you had people kind of living in this kind of the mountains on the edge of the city, in kind of shacks and makeshift living conditions. And, there was a feeling among, not to say that, going from 30% poverty, which is unfortunate, to 80% today, obviously things got a lot worse. But I think there was a feeling, and this is one of the reasons why things fell apart, because you'd say if you had this stable, democratic, well-off place, where people are going shopping in Miami, there was a saying in Spanish. In Miami, they were called dame doces, which means like give me two in English, because people had so much money, that they were well-off people. But there was this kind of well-meaning intention to try to do something about poverty in Venezuela. It just wasn't done in a very it wasn't done in a way that really worked out very well for the country. But there's a reason why Hugo Chavez was elected and reelected. He was wanted to really do something for this population, and to kind of see this population and make them feel like they were a part of things and they were a priority. And I think this kind of galvanized a lot of popular support. So there's a reason why, Maduro was not democratically elected and has no democratic credibility, but this movement really begins with Hugo Chavez, and he is at the head of a democratic movement, although he does try to weaken controls or democratic safeguards when he's in charge.
And we arrive at the current day. So we've taken a deep dive on Venezuela here with Professor Ilan Ehrlich on this episode of Bergen Banter. Appreciate the conversation, and I think our listeners are going to appreciate knowing a little bit more about a country that, let's face it, a month ago, I don't think was on very many of our minds at all. So thank you, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Never mind the noise and the chatter. We are here for intelligent, fact-based conversation on Bergen Banter, and we will see you again down the road.